Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's panel on how our modern media landscape fueled the COVID-19 infodemic. I'm Nicole, a graduate student here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I also conduct research at Harvard Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, where I work with a team of researchers and journalists studying the impact of media manipulation campaigns on social movements, elections, and ultimately public trust. Like our hospitals, our media ecosystem is completely overwhelmed right now with questions ranging from the more banal, like where do I get tested for COVID-19? How do I know if I have coronavirus? And is there a vaccine? To the more conspiracy-driven, does 5G affect my health? Or is the flu more deadly than COVID-19? The list goes on, but the fact remains. People are seeking more and more information about COVID-19, and wrong answers could be and have proven to be deadly. To help us navigate this very difficult terrain, I'm honored to introduce three extraordinary academics and writers. Dr. Julie Posetti, who is the global director of research at the International Center for Journalists and whose work investigates media freedom and the digital transformation of journalism. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Vraga, who is an associate professor at the University of Minnesota, where she holds the Don and Carol Larson Professorship in Health Communication. Her work is focused on how people come to understand the news on contentious health, science, and political issues, with an emphasis on how we navigate these disagreements. And last but certainly not least, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Hermann Wasserman, who is a professor of media studies at the University of Cape Town and a scholar in media, ethics, and democracy in Africa. His upcoming research will build on his previous scholarship in misinformation studies with a specific focus on misinfo related to coronavirus in China. So with that said, let's jump in. I'll start with you, Dr. Wasserman. In late June, you delivered a keynote address at the WHO's inaugural Infodemiology conference. I'm wondering if you can speak to the urgency of this moment. Why is it so important that we strengthen multilateral relationships and methods for better understanding, managing, and countering false information?
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be here or there or wherever. I think we are really in a very urgent moment, as you've suggested. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought home that disinformation can literally be a matter of life and death, and that's no exaggeration. We've seen the conspiracy theories, we've seen the false claims about remedies, and here in Africa, we've seen several countries also touting the miracle cures and so on, and these are really very dangerous. But I think it's also important to realize that this is a moment which showed us the cracks in our global societies. It has shown the problems with our communications ecologies, the limitations of the political economy of the media. So the pandemic moment is also a moment, I think, that has foregrounded big inequalities between countries globally, and also within societies. There are already fears, for instance, that the global south will not have ready access to vaccines when they come out. We know within societies, even in the global north, in the US, in terms of things like access to healthcare, different levels of access to reliable information, lack of trust in institutions, polarization of audiences, all these things I think have been thrust to the fore as a result of this pandemic. So the pandemic itself, of course, extremely urgent, extremely important that we root out the misinformation around the pandemic itself, but I think it has also raised broader questions. And I can also maybe speak later. I don't want to go on for too long now, but I think it is also in the African context. I think we've also seen issues around editorial independence, the suppressing of dissidents, surveilling of communications, criminalization of disinformation, trends that have emerged with the pandemic as a sort of smokescreen. And these trends and these issues can probably and will probably persist even after the pandemic itself has ended. So I think it is also, and the last thing I'll say, you mentioned also the work at Harvard. I mean, just last week, there was this report that came out from Berkman Klein Center at Harvard that showed how journalism's professional routines of elite focus and headline seeking and neutrality can also reinforce disinformation in the US. So I think it's also an important moment to think very hard and really give some thought about how to do journalism differently in future. So I think there are many reasons why this is a very important and a very urgent moment.
Great, thank you for that answer. And turning to the journalist here, Dr. Posetti, the UNESCO policy brief that you recently co-wrote titled Disinfodemic, Deciphering COVID-19 Disinformation, tackles some of the gravely serious impacts of false and misleading medical information. Will you walk us through some of your key research findings and why certain formats and sources are so sticky?
Sure. So the reports that you're referring to were called the Disinfodemic briefs. They were written in April at fairly high speed, reflecting a kind of urgent need to respond to the disinformation crisis in the context of the pandemic. And that was because we were seeing really almost instantaneously an avalanche of misinformation and disinformation. We use the term disinfodemic as distinct from what the World Health Organization has referred to as an infodemic, just for the simple reason that the infodemic refers to this flood of information, accurate journalism at one end of the spectrum and official public interest health information. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have false and misleading content, much of which is maliciously shared, some of which is comparatively innocently shared, but nevertheless has deadly impacts. And so we decided to examine this broadly under the banner of disinformation, making the point that although the intent might not be to cause harm in sharing false cures, for example, may come from a place of good intention, but the outcomes can nevertheless be deadly. The impacts can be very severe. So that's why we refer to these two different briefs as the disinfodemic reports. One analyzes the trends we found, and the other one really dissects the responses to the crisis. And so to get to your question, what we found were four key format types being used to disseminate disinformation in the context of COVID-19. The first one was emotive narratives and constructs and memes. And we know that they can take a mix of approaches. So it could be visual, it could be audio-based, but often they're designed to trigger an emotional response. We also identified fabricated websites and identities, so people masquerading as official or reliable sources, websites purporting to represent news organizations or other official sources. Fraudulently altered and decontextualized video, which is very difficult to detect, but also extremely problematic to counter. Often that involves video that is in fact correct at the time of publication, but it's taken out of time context, for example. And disinformation infiltrators, orchestrated campaigns. So where we saw an intersection, for example, with, so your QAnon conspiracy theorists also working as a network, loosely organized, and in some cases, some of these networks were in fact state-backed. And they had a particularly pernicious impact on communities because of the speed with which the disinformation was able to spread and the potential for damage. So we also identified 9 key themes from our analysis of a host of data, which included an analysis of fact checks produced by the International Fact Checking Network. The first theme was around the false information around the origins and spread of coronavirus and COVID-19. So where did it come from? And I suppose two theories that I can point to that are in fact not based in fact. One is that the virus was manufactured in a Chinese lab, which has all of the sort of racist overtones in a political sense, and the 5G network being blamed as some kind of spreader of COVID-19. False and misleading statistics, so the manipulation of statistics, was the second theme. The third theme was misinformation and disinformation around economic impacts. So, for example, this sort of false equivalency connected to an assessment of the impact on public health of contracting COVID-19, particularly in vulnerable populations, versus the benefits of the need to keep society open and pushing towards opening up prematurely. The discrediting of journalists and credible news organizations was a fourth theme. And we see that playing out, of course, not just in COVID-19 related disinformation, but in political disinformation generally, especially in the US at the moment. Then the fifth theme was around the symptoms and diagnosis and treatment of COVID-19. And you'll recall very clearly that we heard everything from gargling salt water as an appropriate cure, right through to potentially ingesting or injecting yourself with bleach, which was a thought track of the President of the United States at one point. And the sixth theme was around impacts on society and the environment. Some of, I suppose, the least dangerous pieces of false information, such as, there's going to be a global toilet paper shortage. As frustrating as that was, it was also, slightly odd. Or that dolphins had suddenly reappeared in the Venetian canals. That, of course, did not happen. The seventh theme was around politicization. So an effort to gain political favor or to consolidate power by politicizing COVID-19. I think the US, again, is a perfect case study, but there are many others internationally. The eighth was around content driven by those seeking to gain financial benefits through fraud. So, scams about cures designed to steal people's data or money. And finally, celebrity-focused disinformation, where we saw both false reports about actors being diagnosed, but actors being involved in the dissemination of disinformation. And I think that correlates with some research that was done also by colleagues at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, where the top sources of disinformation that they identified were political actors and celebrities. So I'll leave that summary there, and I can come back to some of the other findings later.
Yeah, it's fascinating research. I really enjoyed the report.
Thanks.
Yeah, and on the fact-checking bit, this sort of nicely ties into Dr. Vraga's work. So over the years, your work has looked at how social networks can enforce medical misperceptions, as well as act as a powerful force for myth-busting. In a recent article that you wrote called "Correction as a Solution for Health Misinformation on Social Media," you discussed how corrections are an important treatment for misinformation. Can you elaborate a bit on health misinformation interventions? What works and what fails?
Definitely. And I think the first thing to really say, as Julie pointed out for us, is that misinformation comes in many different guises. It has many different goals. And as Herman pointed out, it has structural elements as well. And so there is no one solution to health misinformation anywhere, including on social media. That doesn't mean there isn't any solution. And they can be kind of big solutions or little solutions. They can be proactive things that we can do in advance or responsive things that we can do when we see misinformation. So I want to highlight just two. On the proactive side, I think helping people develop a sense of news literacy, of health literacy, of science literacy, an understanding of how news is created, an understanding of how the scientific process works. All of these can help inoculate people so that when they see something that is blatantly going against the scientific process, or some news article or something pretending to be a news article that is using cues that really, that's just not how news works. They'll be more likely to be skeptical. They'll be more likely to resist that misinformation. So giving people the knowledge and skills that they need to help suss out misinformation themselves. I think the second part of that is the responsive part, and that's correcting misinformation when we see it. Misinformation is a global problem. Correction is a global solution. If we see something that is false, misleading, inaccurate, I think that if everyone kind of committed to responding and putting out the best, most high quality information, as a society, we would be better off. We know that these types of responsive corrections coming from expert organizations can work, but they can also work when they come from everyday users, people like you and me. As long as we're providing credible evidence, as long as we are citing those experts and explaining where we're getting our information from. And most importantly, saying what is true, not just saying what is false. And so I think that means that everyone has a role to play. And I think this can be quite empowering if we think of misinformation response as all of our responsibility, as something that is meant to be empathetic and protective rather than something that's meant to be critical or attacking. It's more likely to have that beneficial effect. But we have shown in multiple studies that fact-checking works, correction works. And so when we see health misinformation on social media, one thing we should be doing is saying something.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd like to drill down a little bit on the everyday user and sort of looking at context more specifically. So Dr. Wasserman, you've written quite a bit about the cultural factors influencing the proliferation of COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation. I found it quite interesting that your research has found that in numerous African countries, people who report higher levels of exposure to disinformation also report lower levels of media trust. I'm wondering if you could speak to the spread of misinformation in COVID-19 in the context of South Africa, and what makes some people potentially more susceptible to mis and disinformation over others?
Yeah, I think this is a, one could go on about the cultural factors and the social factors. I think the most important thing about this is to realize that misinformation, disinformation does not spread in a vacuum. And that whereas it is important to also do the computational work on social networks, there's a lot of really impressive work being done, and sort of that tracking and tracing of where misinformation comes from, who spreads it. I think it's also important to understand why it has a certain purchase, and why it appeals to people, and what the motivations might be of people sharing it. That's been our research. I've been also working with this with a colleague, Danny Madrid-Morales, and we've published some work on this, on the motivations of people sharing misinformation in Africa. And a lot of that had to do with, well, there are various reasons. I mean, one particular reason, for instance, is the so-called misplaced sense of civic duty. So especially in settings where there's a high degree of community reliance, where people are reliant on each other to warn and help and support each other, context of poverty, for instance, or where there's a high degree of conviviality, where people, there's this sort of big communal cultures and networks. People often feel the need to warn each other, and even if they know, and that's the alarming thing in our studies, apart from the fact that we've seen that there's a very high perceived rate of exposure to disinformation in African countries, there's also a very high rate of people saying that they would share the misinformation, or they have shared misinformation, even knowing that it might not be true. And often the case for that might be that they would want to warn other people just in case it might be true. There might be a very slim chance that this herbal remedy could cure you, and I don't think I believe it myself, but let me just forward it to my friends just in case it helps them. And then in terms of the trust, I think what is also important to note is that especially in the African context, not only are media users severely affected by the infodemic or the disinfodemic, as Dr. Posetti I think is a very helpful distinction, but they have been exposed to various forms of disinformation for many, many years, and this might range from state propaganda, state ownership of news media. There's even a longer history of colonial powers, and people being lied to, and so there's a history, I think, of people not trusting official sources of information. And there's what is interesting of this context is that there's also a high degree of use of satire and gossip and jokes, and historically this has often played a very progressive role. So people have used gossip to undermine, and jokes and satire, humor, to undermine colonial authorities, for instance, or undermine post-colonial states that are controlling the information. But the problem with that is that it has now also paved the way, I think, for disinformation to take root. And we've seen, for instance, in the South African context, where the government has launched a track and trace app, and one of the comedians, he made fun of this seemingly as a joke to say that the government is watching you and they're tracing your movements and so on, which is entirely false. And he might claim it's a joke, but I mean, it's that sort of mode of engagement, I think, is there's a long history for that. There's a long cultural and social history, but I think it does complicate the way that people, might complicate the way that we respond to misinformation. And I think what Dr. Vraga has just also mentioned in terms of, say, empathetic responses, I think those are important. That those are also included in our repertoire of responses, not only countering information with facts, but also trying to understand and empathetically trying to understand why people do this. So I think if we understand the motivations, why people share misinformation, what the anxieties are, what their social histories are, and so on, we might be better positioned to design interventions that are appropriate for specific types of misinformation.
Thank you. Yeah, so from motivations to intervention, we do have something kind of percolating right now. And I would like to ask Dr. Posetti this question, which is, given the flurry of COVID-19 conspiracy theories, a number of governments from the Philippines to Malaysia to Egypt to South Africa have justified sweeping crackdowns on fundamental human rights, such as free speech and the right to assembly, under the guise of combating fake news. How do we strike a balance between countering harmful disinformation and protecting press freedom? Kind of like the memes and jokes that potentially get situated in a bit of a gray area.
Yeah, they often do. And I think we've made the point in the studies that we've done for UNESCO, and most recently one that was just published I want to say last week, but I think it was more accurately a couple of weeks ago, called Balancing Act, which is a book-length study all around how to deal with the challenges of responding to disinformation, whether that be through technological, educational, regulatory interventions on the one hand, and the need to preserve basic fundamental human rights connected to freedom of expression on the other hand. In fact, Herman, our colleague here, was one of the reviewers on that study. There's a lot of us working in this space, and I think one of the good things about the way we are responding to this as journalists and as scholars is that we're doing so in a really collaborative way. I think that's fundamentally important, the sharing of knowledge and the interdisciplinarity of that, not just in an academic sense, but between civil society and journalism and academic research of the various disciplines. So I think that's a point to make first off, but we are seeing a really worrying trend, and I think Herman flagged this earlier, and in that report, the Balancing Act report, which has been over a year in the making and came out just before Facebook started to make some of its decisions in recent days around a more punitive approach to dealing with disinformation on its platform, particularly where it's connected to public health and political destabilization. And one of the risks associated with what we recommended, which Facebook has now acted upon in a number of cases, one of the risks of more punitive responses, whether that's by the social media companies or governments, is that in the case of the companies, it can lead to censorship, inadvertent takedowns, where perhaps news is caught up in the mix, when there is a response. At the other end of the spectrum, with government-led regulation, as Herman has flagged, we've seen the expansion, the introduction, and the application of so-called fake news laws around the world under the cloak of the pandemic. And those laws, in effect, have been used to sort of criminalize journalism, along with the rights of whistleblowers as well, for example, which of course go hand in hand with the rights of journalists to undertake investigative reporting, often dependent upon whistleblowers. So, pardon me, we've seen pretty disturbing instances of not just the misuse of these fake news laws, but also, as one of you pointed out, attempts to restrict movement, which has gone to, for example, restricting the movement of journalists, restricting journalists' access to government-based information. And one of the things we know, as one of our other colleagues just suggested, is that the accountability mechanisms that are necessary to ensure open and transparent governance around COVID-19 disinformation management require journalists and other citizens with the capacity to correct misinformation, to be able to do so through reporting or speaking publicly. So it's incredibly challenging to try to address these problems. But one thing is clear, that we are at, this is an overused and cliche, but which is what a cliche is, but we are at a tipping point. This is 2020. We have a critical US election coming up. Coronavirus is now a central theme, and it was always going to be relevant, but you have the president, currently theoretically recovering from COVID-19. It's front and center. And we have still, communities reeling from the impacts of the first wave as we heading into the second wave of COVID-19. We haven't figured out how to address with the degree of urgency required some of the more pernicious acts of disinformation, whether that be the vehicles for disseminating the disinformation or the false and misleading content. So it is really challenging, and unfortunately I don't think we don't have the time to be able to wait. We don't have the time to be able to say this won't happen overnight. This is extremely urgent, and that of course raises the risks that we act in a way that is too restrictive in response. So, I think the two things I would point out from that UN study that was just published, one is the need to ensure that responses that are taken do not unnecessarily infringe on freedom of expression rights, including press freedom. And one of the things we produced was a 23-step tool that allows governments to make determinations around policy that respect freedom of expression. So there's a practical kind of approach to assisting with that. But the other thing is that we can't, I think, continue to put the onus on individuals. As much as it's vital that we continue to correct, I fully agree with that. Every citizen has a responsibility to ensure that what they're sharing is accurate and fair, and that what they are amplifying in terms of the content that comes their way, they do due diligence checks on. But we have to put the responsibility, I think, increasingly at the foot of the social media companies themselves. This is an ecosystem failure we're talking about here, and it requires a degree of urgency and response that has only recently, and I'm talking days here, kind of dawned on Facebook, for example. I'll leave my rant there, but that's I think critical.
Yeah, it's nice that they've decided to potentially take down political ads after the election.
Yeah, there's that.
Yeah, not great. But sort of on this onus kind of idea, and it brings me to the idea of shoring up public trust, because that's such a difficult kind of situation to navigate. And so Dr. Vraga, your work has really looked at this question. And so as we chart out all of these new uncertainties and complexities, how do we shore up public trust in science and global institutions like the World Health Organization? Especially given that science is iterative, it's ongoing. So what are some of the tools for separating those trustworthy questions from the type of rapid fire responses that we often see on social media, especially?
Excuse me. I think that's a fantastic question, and one that's not going to be easy to answer. Trust in science is something that is essential. I think Julie's point is excellent, that correction of misinformation has to be a coordinated effort, not just placed on individuals, but also requires journalists, to give us the good information we need, public health officials to be very clear about what is known and what is not known, where uncertainty exists, the basis for their recommendations, platforms to help identify misinformation and create responses and promote the most highly credible information as best they can. In terms of bolstering scientific credibility, I think that there are several things that need to happen. The first is to try to take politics as much out of it as we can. I realize that that's something that I can say we need to do, and yet I can't necessarily offer how that gets done. But we're seeing really worrying trends where trust in scientists has grown throughout the pandemic in the United States among Democrats, not among Republicans. We're seeing worrying divides in terms of whether Democrats and Republicans say they would get a vaccine, something that, and both a COVID vaccine as well as a flu vaccine. And so those are essential public health steps and tools that we need. So trying to make this as apolitical as possible, focusing on the scientific process, the medical process, the experts in the room, and the ways in which experts check each other, and trying to keep politics out of that, because health decisions are political, but the way in which those decisions get made should not be. Another thing that scientists can do is again, that clear communication. Talking about uncertainty actually doesn't undermine scientific credibility, it tends to bolster it. So when we can say, here's what we know and here are the things we don't know, the public responds to that. They can recognize, okay, this coronavirus is new to you too, and it bolsters our trust rather than coming out and sounding certain and then having to walk things back. So I think that those are both really important. And then finally, really just demonstrating the ways in which science benefits all of us, the ways in which scientists really care about the public. That's something that scientists around the world still score very highly on. People tend to think of scientists as doing things that are good for the world. And that's something we should be highlighting and emphasizing and drawing upon to reinforce that scientific and medical expertise that we depend on it during this pandemic and to deal with misinformation.
Given that the panel is, we have someone over in the UK and we have someone in South Africa, I kind of want to ask the same question to both of you. Because we are in the US witnessing quite polarization happening on issues that shouldn't necessarily be wedge issues. They shouldn't necessarily be political questions. And I'm wondering in your own context, if you found that COVID has sort of done the same thing, created the same levels of polarization.
Do you want to start, Herman?
Yeah, go ahead, Julie, go ahead, start.
Okay, well, I was going to say, I see two lived realities in my world, because I'm Australian, as you can tell from my accent, that I live in the UK. And in both countries, I can certainly say that the issue has been politicized, but not to the extent that I observe occurring in the US. And that interpretation is also informed by the organization I work for, which is a US-based NGO. So I'm seeing this as a global trend, which is what we've identified in those reports. But the ways in which it is the people's fear is being manipulated, it builds on the kind of divisive politics connected to race and migration, and takes it to a new level of danger when you're seeing the politicization of fundamental medical facts that can be instantly deadly, such as taking a particular drug or whatever. So I'm seeing that here, but again, not to the extent, as I say, that I have witnessed in the US. I mean, we haven't had Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the UK, exposing others to risk while still being infected with COVID-19, as he was, of course, and hospitalized and very ill. There's been a lack of transparency and a lack of willingness to be scrutinized, I think, in both of these countries as well, but again, not to the extent that we've witnessed with the US. And I think, when you're seeing not just the exploitation of people's fear and the deliberate, decision to put people's lives at risk for the sake of power consolidation, which is how it can be viewed, and you look at the failure to respond appropriately, on the other hand, you really have a you really have a crisis that I'm scratching my head because it's just so confounding, I think, and it's also so very difficult to respond in ways that will affect, and this is back to Herman's work, affect people's willingness to accept accurate health advice and factual journalism about a state's response to this crisis, when the biggest sources of disinformation on COVID-19 are empirically political actors. And, you know, it's really confounding. Over to you, Herman. Is there hope in South Africa?
Yeah, I don't know. I think certainly some of the issues here have been politicized. Depending on which issue, they're at various levels. So I think, for instance, mask wearing, I think the only people that have really politicized mask wearing here are the fringe, very right-wing, I'm tempted to say lunatic right-wing. But other things like the lockdown, for instance, right from the start, that was politicized. And so it's sort of caught up in two different things. And the third thing that I'll mention is there's already a high level of vaccine hesitancy in South Africa. Mm. And that is linked to a mistrust in public health institutions. I mean, so hospitals, often state hospitals are in a dire state, for instance, so people just basically don't trust the public health system. So it's sort of entwined with various things. But I think I would say is what is interesting for me here is the sort of normative stance of the media. And I know, Julie, that in your report as well, you've looked at sort of normative responses. But so I think the media largely has defined their role as that of a watchdog, sort of that monitorial, and which often goes into the space of adversarial role against government, and that's played a very important role in the sort of democratic era, and you know, it has helped to unearth corruption and so on. And there has already been have been instances of corruption around PPE tenders and so on in South Africa already. So that sort of watchdog monitorial role, I think, is very important also in this context. But in some cases, I think that strays over into a sort of contrarianism. And I think those lines between a sort of a watchdog monitorial role and a contrarianism is sometimes blurred by journalism itself. So, for example, I think, you know, when the only mode in which the media tends to engage with government is that of skepticism, of adversarial, you know, monitoring, and granted, often for very good reason, I think there are times when there's a good motivation for collaboration with government and a good motivation for journalists to maybe put some of the skepticism aside and do some of that explanation work that, you know, we've heard of. And I think when you're stuck in this contrarian role that nothing that the government will ever do will ever be right, there's certainly corruption behind every decision. You know, even the lockdown, you know, some of the suggestions floating around was, you know, they're locking down so they can control the economy, and you know, it's a Marxist move and so on. So I think what I'm trying to say is I think that it's politicized, but it goes deeper than that. It goes to the questions of trust. And so here with us as well, we don't see that clear political parallelism, I think, that you see in the US between Democrats and Republicans. I think it's more of a general culture of mistrust that the government is up to no good, and whatever decision they make, whether this is the lockdown or whether it is the track and trace app that they've launched, there must be some sinister motive behind this, and we cannot trust it. And I think that makes it very difficult for public health campaigns to succeed. It makes it very difficult for, and this is not necessarily misinformation or disinformation. It's maybe one could classify it as malinformation if you want to use those sort of three sort of tiers, but it's also about, I think, the role that journalism plays and that sort of blurring of the different roles. And almost sometimes journalists are allergic to the notion that they might ever say something that is supportive of government, you know, for fear of being branded sunshine journalists. And that comes from our developmental context. I mean, as you know, there's a long history of developmental journalism on the continent, and calls for developmental journalism that often have lapsed into uncritical support of government and so on. So I'm saying, you know, that these factors are political and they are politicized, but it goes much deeper in terms of the trust displayed towards government or mistrust, and the role that the media, the journalism plays in amplifying maybe some of that skepticism. And I think that complicates any response, any public health response.
Yeah, for sure. The role of journalism really can't be underestimated here in the sort of proliferation of fake news and disinformation and all of the wonderful things that come with it. So before we move into questions from the audience, one final question for all three of you. So feel free, this is the moment to rant, this is the moment to banter. With the presidential election looming over the US right now, and a sitting president personally battling COVID-19 or recovering from COVID-19, what are some nightmares that you're having? What could go wrong here? And what do we absolutely need to get right in this moment? Who would like to start?
Okay, let me start from, because let's start furthest from the US, geographically speaking.
Good.
You say nightmare. I think I must be honest that the US political scene at the moment does seem like the stuff of nightmares. I mean, it seems like, you know, these metaphors of train crash and dumpster fires and so on. I mean, but what really scares me is, I think, the callousness with which the president of the United States spread disinformation. And there's now already empirical evidence. You know, Cornell University has brought out that analysis of 38 million articles about the pandemic, and they found that President Trump was the largest driver of the disinfodemic. Last night in the presidential debate, Mike Pence also made claims that were afterwards shown to be false. And so what scares me is not only how pervasive that disinformation is, it's not even how organized the networks of those disinformation are, but I think the impunity with which disinformation is spread from the highest US political office. And why that scares me is it creates a culture. I think and again, speaking from the sort of perspective of a cultural environment that will persist. So even, you know, I think this creates a culture of lying, of mistrust, social polarization, and that culture, if that takes root, or maybe it has already taken root, will persist long after Trump is gone, which will hopefully be very soon. But I think, you know, that is for me is what makes me lie awake, because it's not a US specific thing. I mean, I think that culture of misinformation, impunity around misinformation has taken root, and it will take very long to root out. It's much more difficult than just voting somebody out of office.
I guess I'll go next then, as this the next closest member of the panel to the US, and then we can end in the US. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point to note, the impunity factor. And, you know, this is important not just because of the way it undermines public trust in critical independent journalism and scientific and medical facts. It's because it creates such an environment of confusion that nobody knows what to trust or what to believe. And so they end up believing in nothing. So what do, you know, in that situation? It means the narratives with the most powerful pull, the most outlandish conspiracy theories, you know, do they become more believable? And the fact that this can then perhaps become, you know, a cultural norm because it's been triggered in the case of the US, you know, in a democratic state, which has enshrined rights for press freedom, for example, that you can end up in a situation where those acts of, you know, impugning journalists and journalism and the impunity with which that is done in reference to disinformation, you know, being manipulated for the sake of power in an environment, let's be frank, where US-based companies have failed to adequately respond and failed to respond in a timely enough manner to a crisis that has been, to a large extent, fueled by their platforms as vectors for this disinformation. So And it really does put the US in a very important but perilous situation, because if we think about geopolitics, and I always find it fascinating, even in this moment where many analysts have referred to, the collapse of American democracy. And yet, if we were to watch wall-to-wall news television coming out of the States, we would be surprised, probably, those of us who are not based in the States, by the confidence that seems still to be attached to the notion of American leadership. On this question, there is no leadership from the US that we can point to. And I think that creates a really terrible vacuum, because we have historically, certainly in the 20th century and beyond, looked to the US for norm creating behaviors around freedom of expression, and critical independent journalism, has been supported by that. So I can't even remember the question, but I have enjoyed the rant. So I'm going to throw to our colleague in the US now. But it's a really important time, and we can't overestimate just how dangerous this situation is.
So I think, to sum up what both of you are saying, the most important thing we need right now is accountability. And the thing that keeps me up at night is people having to make choices about protecting their health versus exercising their democratic right to hold officials accountable for their actions. I'm not going to speak to which officials, but everyone should be able to agree that the right to vote is one of the most important things we have. And so the thing I want to say is we need to be doing everything possible to make sure everyone has that right, to do so safely, easily, without putting their health at risk. So that is the thing that keeps me up, is that we cannot, there are places I do not feel confident saying that that is true, that people are going to have to make tough choices about whether they want to put their health at risk in order to vote. And so the thing to do now is make a plan and to hold your public officials accountable to make sure you have the right to vote safely, and have your vote counted. And so that's the most important thing. The thing that we can do is hold people accountable.
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. Well, end our discussion on, but we will open it up now to questions from the audience. The first one that's rolled in is essentially about how countering fake news, disinformation with science is a very challenging task. So the question comes in from Miranda, who asks, it seems that misinformation cannot be fought with science-based knowledge. The President of the United States has slogan fake news to push his agenda. How can we counteract misinfo from a business, PR, marketing standpoint versus a science and research? Seems like however we try, people do not want to listen to research-backed information. So I think this is the question of why isn't science sticky? Why doesn't it travel as far?
I'd like to hear your view on that, Emily. I'm going to, given your expertise.
First, I would say it's not that misinformation cannot be fought with science. We do know that correction does work. Fact checks do work. That being said, there's things we can do to make them work even better. We don't have to be just replying with, here are the facts. Being empathetic, being understanding, saying, I can understand why you might be confused. This is a confusing topic. Here's what the best information available is. Here's the highest quality information. I also think that we can do more to make it emotive and emotional and taking advantage of some of the things that misinformation does to make itself sticky. We can do that as well. I don't think we have to be bound by, we are just going to state facts. We can state facts in ways that are interesting and evocative. So I think that the instinct to learn from other related fields is a really good one, and not just be able to say, here are the facts and assume that that's going to be enough.
Maybe I'll chime in now. I think there's a really valuable and important points. We have to be able to learn from the successful business models, shall we say, being deployed by disinformation purveyors. And that does include, to an extent, understanding what it is about the emotional pull of some of these narratives. Is it about just, as some of the psychological discipline area research on this that suggests that people prefer to have their beliefs reinforced than to be contradicted. You know, there is a real pull there. I don't quite know how that translates to journalism, which, as Herman has pointed out, has this, you know, conflictual kind of essence, right? It's about uncovering and revealing and countering, which does create issues in terms of addressing some of these problems of transferring the knowledge in a way that it will stick. You know, there are various methods being trialed around the world, including solutions journalism, which is not a new concept, but it can be effectively applied in the context of the disinfodemic, insofar as, you know, explanatory methods of reporting designed to address a problem with an approach that could potentially inspire or lead to solutions. This is empowering for people, you know, instead of hearing constantly about, as you've just heard me say for the last hour, how frightening this whole situation is. People need to know that there are things that they can do, that there are steps that can be taken. And I think also on top of that, thinking about the ways in which, if I speak about journalism for a second, the ways in which we can apply investigative journalism techniques to analysing disinformation, you know, to create disinformation watching as a beat that goes beyond just fact-checking and debunking, to actually analysing systems, you know, to explaining to people, you know, where are the power dynamics here? Why is this problematic, not just from the perspective of you drinking bleach could equal death, therefore somebody saying you should is false and bad. You know, this is also to be understood in the context of geopolitics and you know, and other challenges of our time. And I think those stories need to be matched with compelling narratives that provide a big picture but allow a drilling down into personal lived experience. So, you know, there are various approaches being tried, and you can look at organizations like Rappler in the Philippines, which is at the very epicenter of many of the attacks that we've been able to unpack connected to state-backed disinformation attacks on journalists and journalism. You can look at organizations like the Quint in India, which is trying to collaborate with their audiences around fact-checking and debunking, and that's being done in many other settings as well. So there are examples of, you know, this kind of work that can be built on, and I think you know, that's probably the best I can contribute at this point. And over to you, Herman.
Yeah, I can only concur and also defer to both of your sort of expertise in terms of those particular areas. I mean, what I would just add maybe, I think the notion of empathy that Emily has mentioned, I think is important in certain contexts. I mean, I think I wouldn't have necessarily empathy with somebody that has a position of power and spread disinformation, but I think in terms of users and in terms of how people respond to those messages, I think it is important to try and understand where they come from. So I would strongly agree with the notion to say that, you know, if your uncle on WhatsApp, you know, the uncle with a PhD from WhatsApp University, as they say, if he sends you this information, say, listen, I know that you're anxious about this, but here is the information that you can go to. So that means that we also have to promote good information, and we also have to make sure that there's good journalism, good scientific journalism out there that we can point to, that it's not our word against theirs, but we can say, there, go and read in a very accessible form how vaccines work, for instance. But in terms of the sort of PR approach, I mean, that's again not my expertise, but I think from a sort of cultural point of view, what we've seen here in South Africa, for instance, and this might be an approach that in other countries that people have also used, but for instance, where there's a strong communal and convivial culture, but also because of poverty, people live in families and they rely on their families, they rely on their grandmothers. For instance, children in child-headed households might have to depend very strongly on their grandmother because their parents have passed away during the HIV crisis, etc. So if you recognize that sort of set of relationships, then what we've seen here, the communication campaign, for instance, has been to say, wear the mask for your granny. So I'm wearing a mask for my gogo, for my grandmother. That sort of taps into the notion that I am responsible for others. It's also part of this sort of an African cultural framework of Ubuntu and interdependence. But I think that for me was a particularly striking way of tapping into the notion of meeting people where they are, trying to understand their anxieties and trying to also understand the social structures within which they operate. And then you can target the information more specifically. And those cultural and social contexts will differ. But I think it is important to understand what people's anxieties are, where they're positioned socially, culturally, and then try to respond accordingly.
And then we have probably just time for one more question. And something that sort of we've talked about a little bit here and there, which is the fact that the onus is on everyone, as well as on platforms, as well as on governments, and larger structures, and that disinformation impacts all of us, but it does disproportionately impact right now minorities and people of color. And so this question comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, with the rise in misinformation around COVID, especially about its origins, it has also led to attacks on specific populations. Are there ways the media and officials can counter it to protect civilians? The question comes from seeing a rise in global xenophobia and misinformation targeting Black Americans and other minorities. How does this play out differently in contexts around the world?
I might start with that one, if that's okay. I was just on a panel earlier today with people as diverse as the former president of Ghana and Rana Ayub, who's an exceptional Indian journalist who now writes for the Washington Post, but who is one of those journalists like Maria Ressa, who really is an emblematic case when it comes to being the target of misogynistic disinformation attacks. And she said that that COVID-19, the coronavirus, when it swept into India initially, it was less a problem of, or the disinformation that was being peddled was less an issue of health-related disinformation and more an issue of religious bigotry and racism. That those were the elements being deployed. So Muslim Indians were being blamed for spreading the virus. And we already know from recent events, say for example, the UN Commission of Inquiry that has found enough evidence to enable a prosecution of the government in Myanmar connected to crimes against humanity and possibly genocide for disinformation against the Rohingya population in that country, which was fueled by Facebook in particular, according to the UN report. So we know that those techniques of targeting and demonizing minority groups, or those who are not necessarily minorities but are nevertheless targeted for suppression and repression, that those efforts have worked. And so you can see then that those seeking to disrupt or destabilize democracies, to chill critical reporting, to avoid accountability, would deploy those same methods and principles in reference to COVID-19. And we've seen that, on the international stage as well, with responses to China's role. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that, China had clean hands any more than any other state involved in this, this disaster that we're now living through. But the way in which, say, for example, President Trump referred to the China virus, I mean, you can see as a result of that, that deployment, the sorts of attacks that occurred, the protests that rolled out internationally bound up with COVID-19, but in response to the alleged murder of an American citizen and other American citizens that followed with the Black Lives Matter movement, also emphasized this, I think. So it's a very tumultuous time. So how does journalism, or how do researchers respond proactively? I think empathy is part of the equation here. It's about ensuring people can relate to the lived experiences of others, but it's also increasingly about explanatory reporting that is factual, but also carries a powerful narrative. And yeah, I mean, I just think it's a case now that if you are, you know, if let's add misogyny to the mix, and sort of misogynistic, racist, bigoted tropes that are being rolled out as part of disinformation campaigns are featured because the proponents of disinformation realize how effective they are at dividing and exposing people to risk.
Let me jump in. I mean, just very briefly, I think just to tag onto that, I think what is important from my perspective here is that the fight against misinformation, again, should be seen holistically. I mean, it's the fight against misinformation should be tied up with a fight for social justice, for instance, for gender equality, for sort of a fair a type of geopolitics that is based in a sort of international human rights and so on. So I think, again, the misinformation around COVID maps onto these other struggles and onto these other contestations. And I think that's why it's important to do that explanatory work that Julie has mentioned. I mean, explain why this might be the case, why there is might be a very good geopolitical reason why President Trump refers to the China virus. And do that explanatory work, but also realize that this is a sort of a much bigger struggle that's tied up with these other struggles of equality and anti-racism and so on.
And Dr. Vraga, would you like to add anything, or?
I would just echo what my colleagues have said, that we need to recognize and articulate the ways in which not just misinformation, but COVID-19 map onto structural systematic inequalities, and addressing them is holistic. You can't just say, I'm going to address misinformation and then assume that that solves the problem. These fault lines make it easier for misinformation to spread, to sow division, and so we have to acknowledge that in part of our solutions.
All right, well, I've kept everyone over time by a couple of minutes, but I really can't thank you enough for joining us for this discussion. I know our students and audience have greatly benefited from all of your expertise, so thank you again for sharing. We will have a recording of this for those who may have missed it, and yeah, thank you again.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Great to chat. Bye-bye.
Bye.